The morning Callum Dray rode out to meet his mail-order bride, he stopped first at the grave on the hill. He always did. The marker was simple fieldstone. No carving, no inscription beyond the name his own hands had chiseled into the surface the winter Nora died. The grass around it had gone gold with the turning season, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves, the way water moves when something heavy has passed through, and the surface is still finding its way back to stillness. He crouched down and set a single wildflower against the base of the stone. It was the only one he had found on the walk-up, a small purple thing growing at the edge of the fence line where the soil was too rocky for anything else to bother. Nora had liked those. She used to gather them in her apron and bring them inside and put them in a tin cup on the windowsill and say they were better than roses because they had not been asked to grow somewhere easy. He had not spoken to the grave in a long time. For months after she died, he had come up here and talked, told her about the cattle and the weather and the way the light looked in the evening. But somewhere in the second year, the words had stopped coming, and now he mostly just came and stood and let the silence do what silence does. This morning was different. He stayed crouched for a moment, one hand resting on his knee, looking at the stone and not at the sky. The September air was cool and sharp with a smell of dry grass and coming cold. He could feel the season turning the way you feel a door opening in another room. Not quite sound, not quite wind, just a shift in the pressure of everything. "I am not looking for what we had," he said quietly, not loud enough for anyone to hear, even if anyone had been near, which they were not. "I know better than that." He paused. "I just need someone who is not afraid of the winter." He stood, picked up his hat from where he had set it on the grass, pressed it back onto his head, and pulled the brim low the way he always did when he was preparing himself for something. Then he turned his back to the grave and walked down the hill toward the ranch, toward the wagon, toward Willow Creek Station, where a woman he had never met was coming to become his wife. The station was not much. A wooden platform, a small building with a telegraph window, 2 benches for waiting, and a water trough for the horses. In summer, it smelled of dust and manure, and the particular sweetness of warm lumber baking in the sun. In September, it smelled of all those things, plus the faint, cold edge that told you summer was through making promises. Callum arrived early. He tied the horses and stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, then put his hat back on, then took it off again. He was not a man who fidgeted. He had made a point of not being that man for most of his adult life, but something in this morning resisted the steadiness he had spent years building, and his hands would not entirely cooperate. He had written to her 3 times. She had written back 4. Her letters were careful and well-formed, the handwriting of someone who had spent years teaching other people how to make letters properly. She had told him she was a school teacher. She had told him she was 26 and had no family nearby and was looking for honest work and honest company in equal measure. She had not told him everything. He had understood, reading between the precise lines of her script, that there were things being left out. There were always things being left out. He had left things out too. He had not told her about the grave on the hill. He had not told her that the house still had Nora's curtains in the bedroom, the blue ones she had made from fabric she ordered from a catalog in Cheyenne, and that he had not been able to take them down because that seemed like a kind of erasure he was not ready for. He had not told her that the east-facing bedroom had been empty for 2 years, and that the emptiness had a sound to it, a particular quality of silence that was different from other silences, the way absence always sounds different from quiet. He had told her the ranch was modest, but debt-free. He had told her the winters were hard. He had told her he needed a partner and not a decoration, and that he would not ask for more than she was willing to give. He had meant every word. The stagecoach came in from the east at 10 past 10, trailing a banner of dust that rose into the blue September sky and hung there in the still air. Callum watched it come. He put both hands at his sides and stood straight and told himself, not for the first time, that whatever happened now, he had chosen it. The coach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust and driver's profanity directed at the horses. The few other people on the platform moved forward. A young man with a traveling case, an older woman clutching a letter, a rancher Callum recognized from the far side of the county, come to pick up supplies. The door swung open. A small gloved hand appeared first, gripping the frame. Then the hem of a dress, blue calico, washed so many times it had gone soft as old paper. The color faded from something bright to something quieter and more permanent. Then the woman herself stepped down onto the platform and straightened and lifted her face. She was crying. Not crying the way people cry when they are tired or overwhelmed and need a moment to recover. Crying the way people cry when they have been crying for a long time and are no longer sure they can stop. Tears had tracked pale lines through the dust on her face. Her eyes were red at the edges, blue at the center, and so full of something so tightly held that Callum felt the weight of it from 10 feet away. She clutched a small travel bag against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something when it is the last thing left that belongs entirely to you. She did not look around in wonder. She did not smile. She did not do any of the things he had half imagined, standing up here, waiting, turning the possibilities over in his mind the way you turn a stone in your hand when you are thinking. She just stood there in the September light and tried to hold herself together, and did not quite succeed. Callum walked toward her. He removed his hat before he reached her, a habit so old it did not require thought. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give her room. "Callum Dray," he said. She nodded, one small, controlled movement. "Isobel Hale." Her voice broke on the second word, just slightly, a crack in something that had been held under pressure too long. Around them, people were moving and talking and paying no particular attention. The driver was handing down luggage. Someone was greeting someone else with the loud joy of long separation. Ordinary life, doing what ordinary life does, moving around the edges of the moment without touching it. Callum reached into his coat pocket and drew out a handkerchief. Clean, folded, pressed into a square by hands that were more accustomed to fence posts and saddle leather. He held it out to her without ceremony. She looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly. "If something's wrong, you can say so." She took the handkerchief. Her fingers, when they brushed his, were cold even through the gloves. Something in her expression shifted then. Not relief, not yet, but something like the first small crack in a wall that has been under pressure for a very long time. She pressed the cloth to her face and breathed and did not speak for a moment. He did not press her. He had learned, living alone with seasons that could not be hurried, that some things required their own time. "I fear I have made a terrible mistake," she said finally. Her voice was steadier now, barely, but enough. His jaw tightened. He had prepared himself for many versions of this moment, but had underestimated how directly the words would land. He was 33 years old, broad-shouldered and sun-worn, and nothing like the men she had known in whatever city she had come from. He knew how he looked. He had never had cause to apologize for it, but he understood that looking could tell a story that choosing might not confirm. "Is it me?" he asked, simply. The way he asked direct questions, without decoration. She looked at him quickly, almost startled. "No," she said. "It is not you." Her eyes moved briefly around the platform, the other people, the public quality of the moment. "May we speak somewhere private?" He nodded once, and that was enough. The road to the ranch ran 4 miles through open country, through grassland gone gold and tawny in the September light, past the dry creek bed and the ridge of red rock that turned copper in the afternoon sun. The sky above Wyoming in September was the kind of blue that did not apologize for itself, wide and deep and going on so far that it made the troubles of small lives feel both very small and strangely more bearable, as if scale alone could redistribute the weight of things. Isobel sat beside him on the wagon seat, her travel bag in her lap, her spine very straight. She had stopped crying. The handkerchief was folded in her hand. She looked at the land the way you look at something you have never seen before and cannot yet judge, taking it in without judgment, storing it for later. They had been on the road for perhaps 10 minutes when she spoke. "I lied to you," she said. Not a confession spoken softly, not a thing eased into. Said directly, looking at the road ahead, the way someone speaks when they have been carrying something too long to carry it a single step further. Callum kept his eyes on the horses. "About what?" "In my letters. I told you I left my teaching position voluntarily." Her fingers tightened once on the bag in her lap. That was not true. The wagon rolled over a rut in the road. He steadied the horses with a small adjustment of the reins. He did not speak. He had found, over years of dealing with cattle and weather and the particular honesty of physical work, that silence was often the more generous response. It gave people room to finish what they had started. "The headmaster's son," she said. "His name was Victor Ashworth. He made a proposal I refused. He was not accustomed to being refused." She paused. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the road with a sound like something breathing. "He placed documents, a receipt for a withdrawal from the school's charitable fund, with my signature on it. Not my signature. Something near enough to fool people who were not looking closely." Her voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this long enough to say it without breaking. The board believed him. The families believed him. My own family. She stopped. They believed him. Callum said nothing, but his hands on the reins were not entirely still. "No school would hire me after. I had no income and no character reference and nowhere to stand." She turned her face slightly, not quite looking at him, but no longer entirely away. "I answered your advertisement because it was the only ground left." The road crested a low rise and the ranch came into view below, the house and barn and corral, the cattle moving in the far pasture like slow brown shapes in the golden grass. He had built most of it with his own hands over 10 years, in the mornings before light and in the evenings after the day's work was done. It was modest by the standards of some, and it was his by every standard that mattered. Callum slowed the horses. "Out here," he said, "a person is judged by what they do." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the land ahead, the ranch, the particular quality of late morning light on the grass. Not by rumors carried on city wind. He heard her exhale. A small sound, barely anything, but the kind that happens when something held very tight is released a single degree. I understand if you wish to send me back, she said. You asked for honesty, and I brought you scandal. Miss Hale, he said her name with a firmness that was not unkind, the way you say a name when you want it to carry something. I sent for a partner. I don't need perfection. I need truth. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time since she stepped off the coach. You just gave me truth. That's a reasonable start. She met his eyes. Her own were still red at the edges, still holding everything she had been carrying, but there was something else in them now, something that had not been there on the platform. Steel, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Yes, she said, quietly, but without hesitation. He clicked to the horses. The wagon moved forward, down toward the ranch, down toward whatever was going to happen next. The golden dog met them in the yard, rushing out from behind the barn with its tail moving in wide, joyful arcs, the way dogs do when they have been waiting, and the waiting is finally over. That's Copper, Callum said, stepping down from the wagon. He approves of most good people. Isobel climbed down on her own side before he could come around to offer assistance, which he noticed and did not comment on. She crouched carefully in the dust of the yard and held her hand out, knuckles down, the way someone does who has been around animals before. Copper pressed his nose into her palm and then sat down in front of her with the air of a judge who has reached a verdict. He has excellent judgment, she said. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had managed since stepping off the coach. Inside the house, Callum showed her through the rooms with the economy of a man unaccustomed to giving tours. The kitchen, the sitting room, the narrow staircase. At the top, a door on the right, the room he had prepared. A clean quilt on the bed, new, bought from the dry goods store in town 3 weeks ago. White curtains he had put up himself, replacing the previous ones, plain muslin, nothing that belonged to before. A small vase on the windowsill with 3 late-season wildflowers in it, the same purple kind that grew along the fence line. He had not told anyone he put the flowers there. He would not have known how to explain it without it sounding like something it was not yet entitled to be. We are not married yet, he said at the doorway, the words careful and deliberate. The preacher comes Sunday. Until then, this room is yours. He reached into his pocket and set a small key on the dresser beside the door. Lock is on the inside. Relief moved across her face the way sunlight moves when the clouds shift, not gradual, suddenly there. Thank you, Mr. Dray, she said. He nodded and left her to it. That evening she cooked supper from what she found in the kitchen, biscuits and beans and the end of a ham he had not gotten around to finishing. The biscuits were better than anything that kitchen had produced in 2 years. He did not say so out loud, but he ate 3 of them, which said it more plainly than words would have. They ate mostly in silence, the companionable kind, the kind that exists between people who are still learning what kind of silence they share. She told him about the children she had taught, not about the school or the scandal, but about the children themselves. A boy who could not sit still, but could memorize a poem after hearing it once, a girl who drew maps of places she had never been in the margins of her arithmetic. He listened the way he listened to everything, fully and without interruption. After supper, she washed the dishes and he went out to tend the evening chores. When he came back in, the kitchen was clean, The lamp on the table turned down to a comfortable glow, and Isobel was sitting in the chair by the window with a small book open in her lap, though she was not reading it. She was looking out at the dark, at the Wyoming night settling over the land with all its stars and all its wind. He paused at the door. "Whatever happened in Boston," he said, "stays there. Out here, you choose who you are." She turned from the window and looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight. She did not smile, not quite, but something in her face opened that had been closed since he first saw her on the platform. He went to bed. Isobel did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the room with the clean quilt and the white curtains and listened to the sounds of the Wyoming night, which were entirely different from the sounds of any night she had known before. No street noise, no neighbors, no carriages, only wind through grass, the distant low of cattle, the occasional creak of the house settling around her as the temperature dropped. Sounds that asked nothing of her. Sounds that did not care who she was or what had been said about her in rooms she had not been allowed into to defend herself. 3 days ago, she had believed her life was finished, not ended, but finished, in the way of something closed that would not open again. She had not told Callum everything. She had not told him about the morning the board's decision had been delivered. A formal letter slid under the door of her rented room, and how she had sat on the floor beside the bed for an hour without moving. She had not told him about her mother's face at the door when Isobel had gone to explain, the way her mother had looked at her like a problem rather than a daughter. She had not told him about the boy named Tommy. That was the part she kept separate from everything else, kept somewhere private, because it was the part she could not say without coming undone, and she was not yet ready to come undone in front of this man who had offered her dignity when he had been under no obligation to offer her anything at all. She got up once in the middle of the night to find a candle. She opened the wrong drawer in the kitchen, looking for one. Inside the drawer, she found a piece of paper, folded once. She did not intend to open it. Her fingers moved before her better judgment could catch up, unfolding it in the dim light from the banked stove. It was a document, a legal document, formal and carefully written in a hand she did not yet know well enough to call Callum's, but that she would later recognize as unmistakably his. A partnership agreement for the ranch. Her name had been written in a blank space left for it, written in with ink and full intent. Half of everything, to be held jointly. She stood in the dark kitchen and read it twice to be sure she had understood. At the bottom of the page, below the formal language and the carefully drawn lines for signatures, there was a sentence that was not part of the document. Written separately, in a different moment, the ink a slightly different shade, as though the pen had been dipped again. It said in that same careful hand, "If she..." And then it stopped. No more words. The sentence left unfinished, the thought broken off mid-breath. Isobel stood in the dark and looked at those 2 words for a long time. If she what? She folded the paper exactly as she had found it and placed it back in the drawer and closed it without a sound. She went back upstairs to the room with the locked door and the white curtains, and she lay down on the clean quilt, and she stared at the ceiling while the Wyoming wind moved outside and the stars turned slowly overhead. And she thought about a man who had drawn up a document to give her half of everything he owned before she had even arrived. Before he had known if she was honest or frightened or capable or broken. Before he had known anything about her except that she was coming. She thought about that sentence. If she. She thought about what kind of man writes a sentence like that and then cannot finish it. Sleep, when it finally came, was the first quiet sleep she had known in months. The first full day on the ranch, Isobel woke before the sun. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar dark, listening, placing herself. The wind, the cattle, the creak of the house. Then she remembered where she was, and the remembering was not the dread she had half expected. It was something quieter than that. Something that did not yet have a name, but was not afraid. She dressed quickly in the cold and went downstairs. Callum was already gone. A note on the kitchen table, written in that careful hand she was beginning to recognize. Gone to check north pasture. Coffee on stove. Rest if you need it. She stood at the table and read the note twice. Not because it was complicated, because no one had written her a note like that in a very long time. A note that assumed she was a person whose comfort was worth considering. She did not rest. She built up the fire in the stove and drank the coffee he had left, which was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. And then she rolled up her sleeves and looked at the kitchen the way she had always looked at a new classroom on the first day of a teaching post, with the eyes of someone taking inventory, seeing what was there, what was missing, and what could be made of both. By the time Callum returned at mid-morning, the kitchen was a different room, not unrecognizable, not imposed upon. She had not moved furniture or changed the arrangement of things that carried the settled weight of years. But the shelves had been wiped, the pots ordered by size, the loose floorboard near the stove secured with a nail she had found in the tin on the windowsill. The windows were open to the September air, and the smell of beeswax polish was just beginning to fade into something clean and permanent. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at it. She was at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of her, which he had not asked her to touch, but which he had left in clear view on the kitchen shelf, and her expression was the focused, slightly distant look of someone who has found something that requires careful attention. "You've been busy," he said. "I hope you don't mind." She looked up. The ledger was on the shelf. "I wasn't certain if you wanted me to look at it, but I noticed the binding was open to the accounts page, and I thought—" She paused. "I can close it." "What did you find?" She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Then she turned the ledger toward him and placed her finger on a column of figures near the bottom of the page. "These entries," she said. "Cattle count for the spring and summer quarters." She moved her finger across the page to a corresponding column. "And these, the sales records for the same period." She looked up again. "They don't match, not by error margins, by enough that it requires an explanation." Callum came to the table and looked at the page without speaking. He looked for a long time. "Show me," he said. She walked him through it, column by column, entry by entry, the careful, patient manner of a teacher who understands that understanding cannot be rushed. She had been a school teacher for 4 years. She knew how to build an argument from evidence, how to show the work so that the conclusion arrived as something earned rather than asserted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you to find this?" he asked. "About an hour," she said. "Maybe less." He straightened, looked out the window at the yard, at the barn, at the ranch he had built over 10 years with his own labor and his own judgment, and apparently with at least one person inside it who had been taking from him a piece at a time. "Silas Pruitt," he said, not a question. "I don't know whose entries they are," she said carefully. "I only know the numbers. I know whose entries they are." He left the kitchen without another word. and she heard the particular sound of a man with a decision already made walking toward the barn where his decisions would be kept. She did not follow. This was not her fight to finish. She had handed him the evidence. What he did with it belonged to him. She went back to the ledger and noted the date and her findings in the margin in small, precise handwriting, in case it was ever needed later. It was the sort of thing a woman did when she had learned not to assume that the right people would remember the right details at the right time. Silas Pruitt was gone before noon. Isobel was in the yard with Copper when it happened, hanging a set of curtains she had taken down to wash, the ordinary work of a person making a home from a house, and she heard the low exchange of voices from the direction of the bunkhouse, and then the particular silence that follows a conversation that has ended badly. Silas came out with his gear over one shoulder and his hat pulled low. He crossed the yard toward the road without looking at Callum, who stood in the bunkhouse doorway with his arms at his sides and his face absolutely still. But Silas looked at Isobel. He did not stop walking. He did not speak. He just looked at her as he passed, a long, flat look that carried in it something she recognized, not quite anger, something colder than that. The look of a man filing something away for later use. "You'll regret this," he said. To her, not to Callum. To her specifically, as if Callum were not standing 12 feet away. She did not reply. She held his gaze until he looked away first, which he did, and then she turned back to the curtains, as if he had already ceased to exist, which was exactly the response she had intended. Callum came to stand near her a few minutes later, close enough to speak quietly. "You did well," he said. She clipped a curtain to the line. "I only read the numbers." "You read more than that." She reached for the next curtain and did not answer, because he was right, and they both knew it. And some things do not need to be said twice to be understood. The days settled into a rhythm, not the rhythm of ease, not yet. The rhythm of two careful people learning the geography of shared space, where the edges were, what required negotiation and what could simply coexist. She cooked and he ate. He tended the cattle and she kept the accounts and cleaned and prepared the house for the winter that was already beginning to make its presence known in the early mornings, in the thin crust of frost on the water trough that melted by 8 and returned by dark. There were small discoveries. She discovered that he took his coffee outside when the weather allowed, standing at the edge of the porch with both hands around the cup, looking at the land with an expression she could not quite read, but which was not unhappiness. It was something more considered than that. The look of a man who has built something and is taking stock of it each morning to confirm it is still there. He discovered that she read in the evenings, not dramatically, not performing literacy, but quietly and completely, the way some people eat when they are truly hungry, without awareness of anything else. He had not had books in the house for 2 years. He ordered 3 from the catalog in Cheyenne the second week she was there, and left them on the kitchen table without comment. She looked at them for a long moment the morning she found them, and then put them on the shelf next to her own, and did not make anything of it out loud. He did not want her to make anything of it out loud. He wanted her to just put the books on the shelf, which she did. The Sunday morning of their wedding was clear and cold, the sky washed pale by the season, the mountains in the distance carrying their first permanent snow of the year on the upper peaks. Isobel stood at the bedroom window in her dress, the simple blue one she had brought from Boston, pressed as carefully as the small iron in the room would allow, and looked at those mountains and thought about what it meant to marry a man she had known for 7 days. She had thought about it quite a lot in those 7 days. Not with fear exactly, but with the careful, clear-eyed accounting she brought to most things. What she knew about him and what she did not. What she had observed and what remained opaque. What she knew: he was a man who got up before dawn and worked until dark and did not complain about either. He was a man who wrote notes to leave on the kitchen table for a woman he barely knew. He was a man who had drawn up a partnership agreement before she arrived, who had fired a dishonest ranch hand without a single moment of hesitation or doubt, who had stood in the yard and let her hold Silas Pruitt's gaze without rushing to intervene, because he had understood somehow that she needed to do it herself. What she did not know, what he carried when he went to the hill, what had broken in him when his wife died, whether the wall she could feel around him was the kind that could be opened or only the kind that could be stood outside of, respectfully, for the rest of a life. She had married for worse reasons. She had, in fact, almost married for the worst reason of all, which was that Victor Ashworth had been pleasant and educated and had told her she was extraordinary, and she had wanted very much to believe him. She put on her hat and went downstairs. The church was small and white and smelled of wood smoke and candle wax. Perhaps 40 people had gathered, more than she expected, because Willow Creek was the kind of town that considered a wedding sufficient cause to close the feed store for an hour. Dorothea Marsh found her in the small side room before the service. She was a large woman with a warm face and the particular competence of someone who has managed difficult situations for so long that ease itself has become a kind of skill. She brought Isobel a small bunch of late wildflowers, the purple ones, tied with kitchen string. "From the fence line," Dorothea said. "I noticed you'd been picking them." Isobel looked at the flowers. She had picked them twice since arriving, once for the windowsill and once for no reason, except that her hands had needed something to do on a morning when her thoughts had gotten larger than the kitchen could contain. "He's a good man," Dorothea said. Not consolation, not reassurance, simple statement, the kind that comes from years of watching. He's been a very lonely one. There's a difference, and the difference matters. She paused. "He doesn't know how to ask for things. You'll figure that out." "What kind of things?" Isobel asked. Dorothea looked at her with the steady eyes of a woman who had seen many things and explained very few of them. "The ordinary ones," she said. "That's always what it is, in the end." She squeezed Isobel's hand once, firm and brief, and went back into the church. Callum stood at the front in a dark coat, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in the way he turned it when he was thinking about something more than he was saying. He looked up when she came in, and his hands went still. She walked to him down the aisle between the occupied pews, past the faces of 40 people she did not yet know, and did not look at any of them. She looked at him. It seemed to her the most honest thing to do, in a church at this moment, the thing most deserving of honesty. The preacher read the words. When it came to the ring, Callum's hands were not entirely steady. She felt that small tremor as he lifted her hand, as he moved the ring along her finger. She did not look down at the ring. She looked at his face, at the particular expression on it, which was not happiness exactly, but was something that lived in the same country as happiness and might, with time and careful tending, become it. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said. Callum looked at her. The question was in his eyes, genuinely there, not performance, actual inquiry. Her consent mattered to him in a way that was so simple and so uncommon that it almost undid her composure entirely. She nodded. He kissed her gently, briefly, a kiss that made no demands and kept no promises it was not yet entitled to make. But something passed between them in that brief contact, something that had no name yet, but was real. The way the first thin ice of November is real, even though it cannot yet bear any weight. When it was over and the church filled with sound, with voices and congratulations and the particular happiness people bring to other people's milestones, Isobel stood beside her new husband and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that the ground beneath her was not moving. 3 days after the wedding, Silas Pruitt walked into the telegraph office in Willow Creek. Isobel did not see it happen. She was at the school, speaking with the school board chairman about the possibility of a position, and Callum was at the north pasture checking the fence line before winter made the work impossible, and Dorothea was in her shop weighing out flour for the Hendersons, and Deputy Amos Whitfield was eating his lunch at his desk, which was in the back of the building and not in a position to observe the front. Silas went to the window and paid for a message and gave the operator the address and the words, and the operator, being a professional, sent them without comment. The message went to Boston, to an address Silas had been given before he ever came to Wyoming, given to him along with the instructions that had shaped the last several months of his employment on the Dray Ranch. He had done his job. He had kept his eyes open and his mouth shut and waited, and now the waiting was done. The message was brief. Found her, Willow Creek, Wyoming. Married, Dray Ranch, 4 miles east. He left the telegraph office and rode out of Willow Creek without stopping anywhere else. And nobody particularly noticed him go, because the town had already stopped thinking of him as someone who belonged in it. The days continued. October came in cold and bright. Callum began the work of winterizing the ranch, the serious, methodical preparation of a man who has been through enough Wyoming winters to understand that the land has no patience for the unprepared. He and the 2 remaining ranch hands, brothers named Ned and George Farley, spent long days sealing the barn, stacking cordwood, checking the integrity of every structure against the wind that would come. Isobel helped where she could, and learned where she could not yet help, which was most places but was diminishing. She learned to milk the 2 dairy cows, badly at first and then adequately, and then well enough that she did it each morning without being asked. She learned the particular geography of the root cellar, what was stored where and why, and reorganized a portion of it to reduce spoilage through the winter in a way that Callum observed and did not comment on, but which she noticed him describe to George Farley a week later as if it had been his own idea, which she found not annoying but quietly, privately, amusing. There were evenings by the fire, not romantic evenings, nothing so deliberate as that. Just 2 people occupying the same warm room at the end of cold days, both tired, both with the particular looseness of people who have worked hard and know they will work hard again tomorrow. He read. She read or sewed, or sometimes simply sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the fire and thought about nothing in particular, which was a luxury she had not permitted herself in years. He noticed when she was cold before she said so. The 3rd time a draft came through the gap in the south window, and she pulled her shawl tighter without speaking. He got up without a word and stuffed the gap with a strip of cloth from the rag box. And on his way back to his chair, he set a second blanket on the arm of hers. He did not say anything. He sat down and picked up his book. She did not say anything either. She reached for the blanket and put it over her lap and looked at the fire and felt something that she did not yet have the confidence to name settle quietly in her chest. On the 12th of October, Callum received a telegram. He was alone when it arrived, having ridden into town for supplies. The telegraph operator handed it over with the neutrality of a man who had handled enough messages to know that the contents of any particular one were not his business. Callum read it standing at the counter. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his inside coat pocket and finished his business in town and rode home and unhitched the horses and unloaded the supplies and ate supper and helped Ned Farley fix a hinge on the bunkhouse door and did all of these things with his face entirely composed. The telegram was from Boston. The sender identified himself as representing the Boston Board of Education. The language was formal and precise, the language of institutions that have learned to say threatening things in the most reasonable-sounding words available. It requested confirmation of the current whereabouts of Miss Isobel Hale, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. It indicated that a matter of ongoing inquiry required her cooperation. It suggested, in the careful way of letters that have been written by lawyers, that her voluntary participation would be preferable to other arrangements. It was signed, V. Ashworth, on behalf of the board. Callum sat in his chair that evening and looked at the fire while Isobel read across the room, and he thought about what it meant that Victor Ashworth had found her here, in Wyoming, less than a month after she arrived. He thought about the only way that was possible. He thought about Silas Pruitt, and then he thought about the document in his desk drawer, the partnership agreement with her name written in it, and the sentence at the bottom that he had never been able to finish. And he thought about what it meant to have made a promise to someone and then fail to give them information that belonged to them. He put the telegram in the desk drawer. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He knew, even as he told himself this, that there was no right moment for a thing like this, only the moment when the cost of waiting exceeded the cost of speaking. He was not yet sure he had reached it. Several evenings later, Isobel came into the study to bring him his coffee. He was standing at the desk. There was a piece of paper in his hands. When he heard her step in the doorway, he folded it in one motion, clean and quick, and set it face down on the desk and turned toward her with a face that revealed nothing. She set the coffee on the corner of the desk. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Ranch matter," he said. She nodded, looked at the folded paper on the desk for just a moment, not pointedly, just the natural movement of eyes in a room. Then she looked back at him. "Of course," she said. She left the study and went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and looked out the dark window at the dark yard and thought about what she had seen in his face in that moment. Not deception, exactly. Something more complicated than that. A man in conflict with himself about something he had not yet decided. She had seen it. He had seen her see it. Neither of them spoke of it. But the silence between them that evening had a different quality than the silences before. A weight to it. A thing unsaid pressing against the ordinary sounds of the house from the inside. She dried the dishes and stacked them on the shelf and banked the fire in the stove, and went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Whatever was in that paper, it was about her. She was as certain of that as she had ever been certain of anything. And whatever it was, Callum Dray had looked at it and folded it and said ranch matter, and she had looked at him and known it was a lie. Not a lie born of cruelty. She did not think him cruel. She had spent enough time in rooms with cruel men to know the difference between cruelty and the kind of silence that comes from a man who does not yet know what to do with what he is holding. She lay back on the clean quilt and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the dark, the cattle shifted and settled, and the house creaked once around her like something breathing. Whatever it is, she thought, it is coming. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she was not certain she had enough ground left to stand on when it did. The blizzard came without proper warning. There had been signs, the way there are always signs when you know how to read them. The particular quality of the sky in the days before, that flat white ceiling pressing lower each morning as if the weight of what it carried was becoming too much to hold. The cattle moving closer to the barn without being driven. Copper refusing his usual evening run around the yard, sitting instead at the door with his ears back and his eyes on the horizon with the focused attention of something that understands weather as a language. Callum had read all of it correctly. He had spent the previous 2 days in preparation, bringing in extra wood, checking the water supply, reinforcing the barn door against the wind that was coming. On the morning the storm finally arrived, he was already awake before it reached the ranch, standing at the kitchen window watching the sky come down. Isobel came downstairs to find him there with his coffee, both hands around the cup, looking north. "How long?" she asked. "Days," he said. "Maybe 5. She looked out at the horizon, at the white wall already moving across the grassland toward them, swallowing the distance in slow, absolute increments. She had never seen a blizzard. Boston winters were cold and gray and sometimes brutal, but they were urban winters, contained by streets and buildings, managed by the presence of other people doing the same thing in adjacent rooms. This was something different. This was the land itself deciding something and not asking anyone's opinion. "What do we need to do?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. They worked through the morning ahead of the storm. Callum ran rope between the house and the barn, a lifeline in the whiteout that could save a person from wandering 6 feet off course and freezing to death 20 yards from their own door. Isobel filled every vessel in the kitchen with water from the well, every pot, every pitcher, every jar that could hold it, because once the storm was fully down, the well would be buried and unreachable. She brought in the last of the root vegetables from the cold cellar and stacked the extra firewood inside the back porch until there was barely room to stand. The storm hit at noon. The sound of it was the first thing, a sound like the entire sky taking a breath and then releasing it all at once. A long, sustained roar that was not quite wind and not quite anything else, and pressed against every surface of the house simultaneously. Then the white came, not snow falling, but snow being thrown, horizontal and relentless. And within 10 minutes, the world outside the windows had been replaced by a moving wall of white that had no depth and no distance, and gave back nothing but its own blankness. Ned and George Farley were in the bunkhouse. Callum had ensured they had enough food and fuel. For the duration of what was coming, the bunkhouse and the main house were separate countries, which meant that for the first time since Isobel's arrival, she and Callum were entirely alone. The first day passed in practical industry. There was enough to do to fill the hours without either of them having to decide what to do with the hours. She cooked, he maintained the fires. They both tended the small inventory of tasks that a house under siege by winter requires. Copper stayed inside, installed in front of the kitchen hearth with the proprietary ease of a dog who has been waiting for exactly this permission. They spoke about practical things, how much wood they had, whether the cattle were secure, the particular requirements of the storm as it developed through the afternoon and into the evening. But there were silences between the practical things, and the silences were different from before. The storm had changed the quality of the air inside the house, the way storms always change the quality of enclosed spaces, making them smaller and more intimate, stripping away the buffer of ordinary life that allows two people to exist in proximity without actually meeting. She found that first evening that she was aware of him in a way she had been carefully managing not to be. The way he moved through the house, economical and quiet. The particular way he set a log on the fire, with a precision that suggested he had thought about where it needed to go and why. The way his hands, rough and calloused and capable of extraordinary practical force, could handle a coffee cup or a book page with a gentleness that seemed not performed but simply natural. She told herself it was proximity, that any two people sealed into four walls by a Wyoming blizzard would become aware of each other simply through the arithmetic of shared space. She was not entirely convinced. The second day. The storm showed no signs of relenting. The wind had, if anything, increased overnight, and the snow against the windows had built into thick white walls that turned the glass opaque and made the rooms feel lower and closer than they were. Callum came in from his morning check of the barn rope, ice in his beard, his coat white, stamping his boots at the door. Isobel handed him a towel without being asked and poured the coffee that was already waiting. He sat at the table and thawed in stages, the way cold men do. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she noticed the blue handkerchief she had been using as a dishcloth was not her own. She had pulled it from the drawer that morning without thinking. It was similar to her others, but smaller. The edges finished differently, and when she turned it over, she saw the embroidery in the corner. A name in blue thread. Nora. She set it on the edge of the sink very carefully and stood still for a moment. Then she dried her hands and carried it to the table and set it down in front of Callum without speaking. He looked at it. Something moved in his face. Not pain, or not only pain. Something older than pain. The thing that lives on the other side of pain when it has been carried long enough that it has become part of the structure of a person rather than a wound in it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know. I'll keep them separate." "It's all right," he said. But he picked up the handkerchief and held it in his hand for a moment, and she saw his thumb move once across the embroidered name, a gesture so small and so habitual that she understood he had done it many times before without being aware of doing it. She sat down across from him. She did not say anything. She simply sat and waited and let the fire do what fires do in small rooms on winter days. He looked up at her, then back down at the cloth in his hands. "She made these herself," he said. "Ordered the thread from a catalog and spent a whole winter embroidering everything that stood still long enough." He paused. "She said if something was worth keeping, it was worth marking." Isobel said nothing. She understood that silence was the right response here, that the wrong word, or even the right word too soon, would close something that was very carefully and slowly opening. "She was sick for 8 days, he said. "I kept thinking each morning that the fever would break. That's what fevers do. They break." He set the handkerchief on the table, smoothed it flat with one hand, the gesture precise and careful. The last night I went for the doctor in town. 4 miles in the dark in a blizzard. Not this bad, but bad. He stopped. He was already gone on another call. By the time I got back, she was gone too. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the walls. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, he said. I couldn't go in. I just stood there. He looked at the handkerchief. I kept thinking I should have gone for the doctor sooner. The day before. The day before that. There was always a day before that. You couldn't have known, Isobel said quietly. No, he said. But knowing that doesn't change what I think about at 2 a.m. She looked at him across the table, at the particular quality of his face in that moment, stripped of the composure he wore the way other men wore coats, and she saw what was underneath it. Not weakness, something more honest than weakness. A man who had been carrying something alone for 2 years and had not put it down because there had been no one to put it down in front of. I had a student, she said. His name was Tommy Alcott. He was 8 years old, and he could not read. She looked at her own hands on the table. His family was not a kind one. His father thought difficulty in reading was a moral failing rather than a practical problem. The other children could tell, the way children always can tell when one of them has been told they are lesser, and they were not generous about it. Callum watched her. I kept him after lessons every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. We worked through it slowly, letter by letter, sound by sound. He was not stupid. He was actually quite extraordinary at certain things, at memorizing, at drawing, at understanding how mechanical things worked. She paused. By spring, he could read simple sentences. By summer, he could read a full page. She was quiet for a moment. The day the board's letter was delivered, I was planning his autumn lessons. I had found a book about trains and machinery that I thought he would like. The wind moved outside. He ran after the carriage, she said. When I left, he ran down the street calling my name until he couldn't keep up. She stopped. I don't know who is teaching him now. I don't know if anyone kept up the work. She looked at the fire. That is what I think about at 2 a.m. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It had a shared quality, the silence of two people who have given each other something real and are sitting with the weight of it together, which is a different kind of weight than carrying something alone. What was she like? Isobel asked after a while. When she was well? And Callum talked. Not the way a man talks when he is performing grief for an audience, not carefully and with selections chosen for their decorum. The way a man talks when he has stopped pretending that the thing he lost was not as important as it was. He talked about the way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, about the fact that she had named every cow on the ranch and referred to them by name at the dinner table as if they were mutual acquaintances, about the wildflowers in the tin cup on the windowsill, about how she had convinced him, somehow, over the course of a single conversation, to keep the injured horse he had been planning to sell, and how that horse was still in the barn and would probably outlive them both. Isobel listened. She had spent 4 years teaching children to listen as a skill, as a discipline, as a form of respect. She understood that real listening was not the same as waiting for your turn to speak. Real listening was attention offered as a gift, without agenda, without the constant low-level preparation of response that most people called listening, but was actually something else. She listened to him the way she had listened to Tommy Alcott work through a difficult sentence, with her whole attention and without any pressure toward a particular outcome. When he stopped talking, the fire had burned low and the wind outside had shifted from its high roar to a deeper, steadier sound, the sound of something settling in for the long work. "I'm sorry," he said, as if he had done something wrong. "Don't be," she said. He looked at her. "The people we've lost deserve to be talked about," she said. "It doesn't do them justice to keep them locked up somewhere quiet." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not the kind of change that announces itself. The kind that happens underneath everything else, in the structure rather than the surface. The kind you can only see in retrospect when you compare the before and after and realize you cannot identify the exact moment of the shift. The third night, she woke to a sound she could not immediately identify, a low, irregular sound from somewhere below her. Not the house, not the wind, something human. She lay still and listened and understood. She got up and pulled her shawl around her shoulders and went down the dark stairs, one hand on the wall, moving slowly in the near-total dark. The kitchen was lit only by the faint red glow of the banked stove, barely enough to see by, just enough to find shapes in the darkness. Callum was on the floor. He was sitting with his back against the wall beside the cold hearth, knees up, forearms on his knees, head bowed. His shoulders were moving in the particular rhythm of a person who has been trying very hard not to make sound and has reached the point where the effort is no longer sustainable. Isobel stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him and did not move for a moment. She understood something in that moment that she could not have been told and could not have reasoned her way to. She understood that this man, who had met her tears on a train platform with a clean handkerchief and an offer of dignity, who had drawn up documents to give her half of everything before he knew her name, who had fired a dishonest man without hesitation and stood beside her in a church and trembled when he put the ring on her finger. This man had not cried since his wife died. Or if he had done it alone. In exactly this way, on exactly this floor, in exactly this dark. She did not go to him. She did not say his name. She did not do any of the things that would have required him to compose himself or perform recovery or apologize for something that required no apology. She walked to the hearth and sat down on the floor beside him, not touching, just there, close enough that the warmth of another person was present and unmistakable, close enough that the solitude of what he was experiencing was altered, not intruded upon, but altered, the way a room is altered by someone entering it quietly and sitting down. He did not look up. She did not look at him. They sat on the floor of the kitchen in the dark, while the blizzard moved outside, and the stove ticked quietly as it cooled, and Copper breathed steadily from his place by the far wall, and neither of them spoke. After a while, his breathing steadied. After a while longer, the room felt different. Not lighter, exactly. More like a room in which something very heavy had been set down, and both people in it were adjusting to the new distribution of weight. They stayed like that until the darkness outside the windows began, almost imperceptibly, to shift toward gray. She did not leave until she was certain he had fallen asleep, which he did eventually, sitting there against the wall with his head tipped back, a man who had finally put something down. She went back upstairs and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She had not done anything extraordinary. She had sat on a floor in the dark. But she understood that sometimes the most important thing you can offer another person is simply the refusal to leave them alone with the worst of what they carry. She thought about what Dorothea Marsh had said in the small room before the wedding ceremony. He doesn't know how to ask for things. You'll figure that out. She was beginning to. The 5th day. The storm broke in the afternoon, the wind dropping with a suddenness that made the silence feel almost loud by contrast. The snow was still and deep, and the world outside the windows was white and absolute and entirely remade. Callum came down from checking the upper windows and found her at the table with her coffee, looking out at the new white world. He sat across from her. Neither of them mentioned the floor of the kitchen 2 nights ago. She had not expected him to, and she did not need him to. Some things do not require naming to be understood. Some things are more intact for being left where they landed. He reached into his coat and took out the folded telegram. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "I should have given you this 3 weeks ago," he said. "I told myself I was waiting for the right time. That was not entirely honest." She picked it up and unfolded it and read it through once. Then again. She set it down with her hands flat on the table. "He found me," she said. Not a question. "Through Silas Pruitt. I believe Silas was watching for an opportunity from the beginning. Sending him away gave him the occasion." She was quiet. The new silence of the world outside pressed against the windows. "The board wants me to come back voluntarily," she said. "To submit to questioning." "Yes. If I don't, they will send a representative." She looked at the telegram, at the name at the bottom. "He will come himself." "Very likely." She looked at him. "You've been carrying this for 3 weeks." "Yes." "Why did you give it to me now?" He held her gaze without flinching. "Because I told you that out here a person is judged by what they do. And what I was doing was not what I told you I would be." He paused. "You deserve to know. I should not have needed 3 weeks to do what was right." She looked at the telegram. Then she looked at him. "Do you believe me?" she asked, "knowing what you know now, having read this. Do you believe that I am what I told you I was?" The silence lasted long enough that it meant something. Not because he was uncertain, but because he was being careful. And she understood by now the difference between his silences. "I believe you," he said, "enough to have given you that letter rather than burned it." Not the declaration she might once have wanted, but it was a true thing, and she had learned by now to value truth over comfort. Truth could be built on. Comfort without truth was a floor with nothing under it. She folded the telegram, set it on the table beside her coffee. "He will come," she said. "Most likely. When he does, he will bring whatever he has been building since I left." She looked at her hands. "He is not a man who accepts losing gracefully." "No," Callum said. "Men like that rarely are." Outside, the snow-covered world sat in its new silence, everything buried and still and waiting for whatever came next. A jay landed on the porch railing and looked in through the window with bright, unconcerned eyes, and then was gone. Isobel picked up her coffee and finished it. She thought about Tommy Alcott, working through a difficult sentence letter by letter, about how the mistake most people made was trying to rush past the hard part to get to the meaning, about how the hard part, worked through slowly and completely, was itself where the meaning lived. She thought about the floor of the kitchen and the dark and the man sitting beside her on that floor right now, who had not asked for her presence there and had not needed to. She had come to Wyoming with nothing but a travel bag and a ruined name. She had found, somehow, in this house at the edge of winter, a floor she could stand on. She intended to stand on it. Whatever was coming from Boston would have to deal with that. Later that afternoon, Deputy Amos Whitfield's horse appeared at the end of the ranch road, moving fast through the new snow, throwing up white fans with each stride. Isobel watched from the kitchen window as Callum went out to meet him. She watched Callum's face as Amos said whatever he had ridden 4 miles through fresh snow to say. She watched it go still in the particular way it went still when he was processing something he had anticipated but had hoped not to have confirmed. He turned and looked at the house, at the window where she stood. She did not step back from the glass. He came inside and stood at the kitchen door with the cold still coming off him. "Victor Ashworth arrived in Cheyenne this morning," he said. "Amos got word from the station there. He is expected in Willow Creek by tomorrow evening." Isobel set down the dish she was holding. She was aware of Callum watching her, waiting, perhaps, to see what fear looked like on her face, or resolution, or something in between. She turned from the window. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "we had better be ready." Callum crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stood in front of her and placed his hand on her shoulder, not carefully, not with the measured consideration of a man still deciding how much to offer, with the directness of someone who has made a decision and is no longer hedging it. "I will not let you face this alone," he said. She looked up at him, at the face she had been learning, its composure and its depths, and the thing underneath both that she had seen on the floor of a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, when no performance was possible, and only the truth of a person remained. She thought about the last man who had told her he would protect her, about how that sentence from that man had been the beginning of everything she had lost. She thought about the folded telegram on the table, about what it meant that he had given it to her. She believed him, not because she needed to, because the evidence warranted it, because she had spent 4 years teaching children to read evidence carefully before reaching conclusions, and the evidence, weighed honestly, pointed in one direction. "I know," she said. Victor Ashworth arrived on a Tuesday. Isobel knew the moment he stepped off the stagecoach because the quality of the air in Willow Creek changed, the way air changes before a storm, not the honest warning of a blizzard, nothing so straightforward as that, but the subtler shift of something calculated moving into a space where it does not belong and has not been invited. She was at the dry goods store with Dorothea when it happened. She did not see him arrive. She heard it, the particular sound of a man who has rehearsed his entrance, boot heels on the wooden platform with a precision that announced rather than merely moved the low exchange of voices outside, and then Dorothea's hand on her arm, steady and firm. "Don't turn around yet," Dorothea said quietly. Her eyes were on the window. Isobel kept her hands on the bolt of fabric she had been examining and breathed. "What does he look like?" she asked. "Like a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered," Dorothea said. "Until you." Victor Ashworth was 38 years old and looked exactly as Isobel remembered him, which was to say, he looked like money and education and the particular confidence of someone who has spent his entire life in rooms where the rules favored him. He was not physically imposing. He was something more dangerous than physically imposing. He was a man who understood institutions, who knew how to speak the language of boards and committees and formal inquiry, who had spent years learning which levers to pull to make other people move the way he needed them to move. He had requested a meeting of the town council for the following morning. The council chairman, a practical man named Henderson who ran the feed store and believed in due process above most things, had agreed. He had also sent word to Callum. That evening, around the kitchen table, Callum told Isobel what Amos Whitfield had learned about the meeting's intended agenda. Victor was bringing a formal complaint on behalf of the Boston Board of Education. A receipt for a withdrawal from the school's charitable fund, $22, bearing a signature attributed to Isobel. A statement from a witness prepared to testify that he had personally seen her enter the administrative office on the date in question. The witness was Silas Pruitt. Isobel sat with her hands flat on the table and listened to all of it without interrupting. When Callum finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The receipt is a forgery," she said. "I know it without having seen it." "How?" "Because I know the date." She looked at him. "The date on that receipt will be a Thursday. Victor will have chosen a Thursday because Thursdays were the days I stayed late to work with Tommy Alcott. I was in the classroom from 3 until nearly 5 every Thursday afternoon. 15 children saw me there in the morning. Tommy saw me there in the afternoon." She paused. "But Tommy is 8 years old and in Boston, and Silas Pruitt is here." Callum said nothing for a moment. "Is there anything else? Anything that proves where you were?" She started to say no. Then she stopped. She pushed back her chair and went upstairs. The journal had been with her since her first year of teaching. A small thing, brown leather. The cover soft with handling. She had kept it as a professional record, the habit of a methodical person in a profession that required accountability. Each day she taught, she wrote the date, the students present, the lesson given, the particular difficulties and progress of individual children. She had not thought of it as evidence. She had thought of it as memory, as the record of a life she had been proud of before it was taken from her. She brought it downstairs and set it on the table and opened it to the autumn of that year, running her finger down the dated entries until she found the Thursdays. There it was, entry after entry in her own hand, in the ink that had gone slightly brown with time, in the handwriting that was as distinctly hers as her face, with the small curved flourish on the capital I that she had learned from her mother and had never entirely lost even when she tried to write more plainly. Thursday the 9th, 11 students present morning session. Afternoon, Tommy Alcott, individual reading instruction, pages 4 through 7 of the primer, Significant Improvement on Consonant Blends. Thursday the 16th, the date Victor would almost certainly have chosen for the receipt. 10 students morning session, 1 absent with illness. Afternoon, Tommy Alcott, continued reading instruction. She had written in a small notation at the bottom of the entry, "He read the full page today without stopping. He did not know I was counting." She sat at the table with the journal open and pressed her hand flat against the page, against her own handwriting, against the small notation about a boy reading a full page without stopping. Callum looked at it across the table. "No one could have made this," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "It is 8 months of daily entries. The handwriting is consistent throughout. The ink ages differently depending on when it was written." She looked at him. "And the signature on the receipt will not match what is in here. I am certain of it." He studied the page for a long moment. "Bring it tomorrow," he said. The council meeting was held in the back room of the feed store, which served Willow Creek as a courtroom and a meeting hall and occasionally as a church when the weather made the actual church inaccessible. 8 men sat at the long table, Henderson at the center, Amos Whitfield along the wall in his official capacity, Victor Ashworth at one end with his documents arranged before him with the neatness of a man who has done this before. Silas Pruitt sat beside him. Isobel walked in with Callum at her side and felt the room assess her, the way rooms do when a person enters them already carrying a verdict that the room has not yet officially reached, but is already leaning toward. She did not look at Victor. She looked at Henderson because Henderson was the man whose opinion she needed to move, and she had spent 4 years learning to read which person in a room was genuinely listening. Victor presented his case with the polished efficiency of a man who had prepared it thoroughly and was confident in its reception. He spoke about the school's charitable fund, about the withdrawal, about the signed receipt. He spoke about the responsibility of institutions to protect public trust. He spoke about the unfortunate necessity of pursuing these matters even across state lines. He did not look at Isobel while he spoke. That told her something. A man who believed his own evidence looked at the accused. Victor Ashworth kept his eyes on the council because he understood that the council was his audience, not the truth. And the truth was not something he needed to convince. When he finished, Henderson turned to Isobel. "Mrs. Dray," he said, "you may respond." She stood. She did not begin with the journal. She began with something simpler. "The signature on that receipt," she said. "May I see it?" Victor's expression did not change. He slid the document across the table to Henderson, who passed it to Isobel. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down and opened her journal to the first page, where her name was written inside the cover in the same hand that appeared on every entry throughout the book. "My capital I," she said, "has a curved base, a small loop at the foot of the letter. I have written it this way since childhood. My mother wrote it this way. I learned it from her." She set the journal beside the receipt so that both were visible. "The signature on this receipt has a straight capital I, no loop, no curve." She looked at Henderson. "You are looking at 2 different hands." The room looked. Henderson looked for a long time. Victor spoke then, his voice carrying the precise modulation of a man who is prepared for this contingency. "The discrepancy can be explained by the circumstances of signing. People do not always write their names identically under every condition." "No," Isobel agreed, "but they carry their habits." She turned to the journal and found a Thursday entry, then another, then another. 8 months of Thursdays, the same letter, the same curve, the same hand. She looked at Henderson. "I can show you every Thursday from September to April." She turned to the specific date, the entry she had read the night before at the kitchen table. She set the journal flat and read aloud, not from memory, but from the page, so that every person in the room could see that the words were written and dated and permanent. Thursday the 16th. Tommy Alcott, individual reading instruction. He read the full page today without stopping. He did not know I was counting. The room was very quiet. "I was in that classroom," she said, "with that child. At the time, this receipt claims I was in an administrative office removing money from a fund meant for children like him." She closed the journal. "I did not take that money. I was never in that office. This is not my signature." She sat down. Silas Pruitt was called to give his account. He told it with the flat confidence of a man who has rehearsed his lines and believes the rehearsal sufficient. He had seen her, he said, entering the administrative building on that Thursday in the late afternoon. Henderson asked him how he knew the date. Silas said he remembered it because it was the day before a school holiday and the building had been quieter than usual. Henderson asked him what time he had seen her. Silas said late afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Henderson made a note. Then he looked at the journal entry, which was still open on the table in front of him, and made another note. Then he looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has run a feed store for 20 years and has developed, through that occupation, an extremely accurate sense of when someone is trying to sell him something at a fraudulent weight. "The entry in this journal," Henderson said carefully, "records a lesson conducted at 4 o'clock on that Thursday afternoon, with a named child, in the school building." He paused. "You are telling this council you saw Mrs. Dray entering the administrative building at 4 o'clock on the same afternoon that this record shows her conducting a lesson across the school grounds." Silas said nothing. "Those two things," Henderson said, "cannot both be true." The silence in the room was the silence of a conclusion being reached. Victor moved then. Not physically. He had the stillness of a man who has learned that visible agitation is a concession. But something in his face shifted, a tightening around the eyes, the look of someone recalculating the distance between where they are and where they intended to be, and finding the gap larger than expected. He spoke again. His voice was still measured, still carrying the performance of reasonableness. But there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. A harder edge, the sound of a man pressing harder because the gentler pressure had failed. "The journal proves nothing conclusively," he said. "A record can be fabricated as easily as a signature." He looked at Henderson. "What this council should consider is the broader pattern of behavior. This woman left Boston under extraordinary circumstances. She arrived in Wyoming and married within a week. A week." He let the implication settle. "One must ask what circumstances make such haste necessary." Henderson said, "She answered a lawful advertisement for a mail-order bride. That is not extraordinary. That happens in this territory regularly." "Under a false identity," Victor said. "She used her own name," Callum said. It was the first time he had spoken. The room turned toward him. He had been sitting beside Isobel with his hands on the table, and his face carrying the particular stillness that Isobel had learned meant he was paying closer attention than his expression suggested. "She came here as Isobel Hale," he said. "She is now Isobel Dray. She told me the circumstances of her leaving Boston before we were married. I made my decision knowing those circumstances." He looked at Victor with the level, unhurried regard of a man who has nothing to perform because he has nothing to hide. "She did not deceive me. She told me the truth. I believed her. This," he gestured at the papers on the table, "is why." Victor looked at Callum. Something passed between them, the particular communication of two men who understand each other's position completely and are past the pretense of not understanding it. Victor knew he was losing. Callum knew he knew it. The council was watching both of them understand this at the same time. Victor gathered himself. And then he did what Isobel had known, with the certainty of someone who has studied this man's methods, that he would do when the legitimate arguments failed. He turned to face Callum directly, and he made his voice carry just far enough to reach the whole room while appearing to address only one person. "Before you stand so firmly behind your wife's character," he said, "you might ask her how she came to have the money for her train fare to Wyoming." He paused. "A woman dismissed without references, without family support, without income, and yet she arrived here having paid passage from Boston to Cheyenne." He looked at Callum with the expression of a man performing reluctant candor. "Ask her where that money came from." The room went very still. Isobel felt every person in it recalibrate, felt the question take hold the way Victor had intended it to take hold, not as accusation but as doubt, which was always more durable than accusation because it did not require proof. She felt Callum beside her and did not look at him. She was aware in the precise way of someone awaiting something they have feared, of the quality of his stillness, whether it had changed, whether the question had found a gap in what he believed. Callum did not look at her. He looked at Victor. And then he did something she had not anticipated and could not have predicted, something that rearranged in a single moment everything she thought she understood about what she had built in this place and with this man. He reached into his coat. He took out his billfold. From inside it, he drew a folded piece of paper, creased and soft with handling, and he set it on the table in front of Henderson with the same deliberate calm with which he did everything. "The money came from me," he said. "Sent in advance according to the terms of our correspondence. Amos Whitfield witnessed the postal transaction. The receipt is there if anyone needs to see it." Henderson looked at the paper. Victor looked at it. Isobel looked at it. It was a postal receipt, dated correctly, addressed to Isobel Hale, Boston, Massachusetts, signed by the Willow Creek postmaster and countersigned by Amos Whitfield as witness. Every detail correct. Every detail real. She turned and looked at Callum. He was still looking at Victor, and his face was still carrying its composed stillness. But she saw something in it that she had not seen there before. Not anger, not triumph. Something quieter and more certain than either. The look of a man who prepared for what mattered to him. Victor had nothing left. He knew it. The room knew it. The sound the meeting made in its final minutes was the sound of a thing collapsing inward, all the carefully constructed weight of it finding no purchase and no floor. Henderson called a recess of 5 minutes and returned to announce that the council found no grounds to pursue the matter further in Willow Creek, and that any ongoing inquiry from the Boston Board of Education would need to proceed through proper legal channels if it wished to involve a resident of Wyoming territory. Silas Pruitt left the room without looking at anyone. Victor gathered his documents with precise, unhurried movements, the performance of a man who has not lost but has simply concluded his business. And Isobel watched him do it and knew, with the cold clarity of someone who has studied this particular performance before, that it was exactly that, a performance. That the conclusion Victor Ashworth was drawing from today was not that he had been wrong, but that he had been outmaneuvered, and that those were, for a man like him, entirely different things. He passed her chair on his way to the door. He did not look at her, but he stopped, just briefly, beside Callum, and he said something quietly, low enough that only the two of them heard it. And then he walked out into the November cold. Isobel looked at Callum. His jaw was tight. "What did he say?" she asked. Callum was quiet for a moment. "He said Wyoming is a long way from Boston." He looked at the door through which Victor had gone. "And that long distances have a way of shortening." The ride home was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of evenings by the fire, not the easy silence of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. This quiet had a texture to it, a residue of the day, the particular weight of something significant having happened and neither person yet certain how to set it down. It was Isobel who broke it. "The postal receipt," she said. They were halfway home, the ranch visible in the distance, a thin line of smoke rising straight up from the chimney into the still cold air. "You had it ready." "Yes." "You prepared for him to ask that question." "It seemed a likely move," Callum said. "A man like that, when the legitimate argument fails, looks for the thing that cannot be quickly disproven. The money was the obvious choice." She looked at his profile, at the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "You could have told me," she said, "that you had it." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the frozen grass, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Because I wanted to be certain," he said finally, "that I had done it right. Before I told you I had done it at all." She sat with that for a while. "Callum," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the receipt, not for the meeting, not for any particular action. For all of it. For the whole accumulation of small and large things that had led to this moment on this road, with this man beside her." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a man managing a team of horses on a straight road. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "You had the journal." "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." He turned back to the road, but she saw his hands on the reins settle, some small-held tension releasing, and she understood that he had needed to hear it as much as she had needed to say it. The ranch came toward them through the winter afternoon, solid and low and exhaling its thin line of smoke. And Isobel looked at it the way she had looked at it the first day, from a wagon seat, with everything uncertain ahead of her. It looked different now. Not the structure. The structure was the same. The house and the barn and the corral and the cattle moving in the far pasture. The hill with the fieldstone marker at its crest. What was different was that it looked, for the first time, like somewhere she lived. Not somewhere she had arrived. Not somewhere she was surviving or enduring or waiting to see if she would be permitted to remain. Somewhere she had chosen. Somewhere that had, by the slow accumulation of ordinary days and extraordinary ones, chosen her back. She did not say this out loud. Some things did not need to be said to be true. The wagon rolled through the gate and into the yard, and Copper came out from behind the barn with his tail already moving, and the smoke from the chimney bent slightly in a small wind. And somewhere in the barn, the injured horse that Nora had convinced Callum to keep moved in its stall with a sound like something settling comfortably into place. Callum set the brake and climbed down. He came around to her side and offered his hand, not with the careful formality of their early days, not the measured gesture of a man uncertain of his welcome, but simply the way you offer a hand to someone you expect to take it. She took it. She stepped down from the wagon and stood in the yard of her home in the thin November light and held his hand for a moment longer than the step required. Then she let go and went inside to start the fire. Victor Ashworth left Willow Creek on the Wednesday morning stage. Isobel did not go to town to watch him leave. She had no need to see it. She knew it had happened when Amos Whitfield rode out to the ranch that afternoon with the particular ease of a man delivering news that does not require careful handling. "Stage left at 10, he said from the saddle. "Both of them on it." Callum nodded once. Amos touched his hat brim toward Isobel where she stood on the porch and turned his horse back toward town. She stood on the porch for a moment after he left, looking at the road, at the place where it curved around the Red Rock Ridge and disappeared toward Willow Creek. The November air was cold and clean and smelled of frozen grass and distance. Somewhere above the ridge, a hawk turned in slow circles, riding something invisible. She went inside and made coffee and did not think about Victor Ashworth again that day. She found, as the days passed, that she did not think about him very much at all, not because she had forgotten what he had done, or because the wound of it had closed entirely. Wounds of that kind did not close entirely, but they changed. They became part of the landscape of a person rather than the whole of it, the way a scar becomes part of a hand, present but no longer the thing the hand is for. What she thought about instead was simpler and more immediate: whether the south pasture fence would hold through the rest of the winter, whether Ned Farley's persistent cough required a doctor's attention, whether the root cellar's reorganization had been sufficient, or whether she needed to make adjustments before the deepest cold arrived. What she thought about, in the evenings by the fire, was the man reading across the room. Silas Pruitt faced the consequences of his testimony before the council. Amos Whitfield had been thorough in his investigation, and the discrepancies between Silas's account and the documented evidence, combined with the financial records Isobel had preserved from the ranch ledgers, were sufficient to hold him on charges of both fraud and false witness. He did not stay in the county jail long. He was not a man built for staying, but he was gone from Willow Creek, which was what mattered, and the particular shadow he had cast over the ranch since his dismissal lifted with his going. The school board sent a formal letter of reinstatement, 3 sentences, institutional in language, offering no apology, but extending an invitation to resume her position at the beginning of the new term. Dorothea Marsh found her reading it in the dry goods store, and watched her face while she read it and said nothing until Isobel folded it and put it in her pocket. "Well?" Dorothea asked. "They want me back," Isobel said. "I know what they want," Dorothea said. "What do you want?" Isobel looked out the window at the December street, at the children crossing it in their winter coats with their breath-making small clouds, at the schoolhouse at the far end with its new windows catching the gray light. "I want to teach," she said. "I have always wanted to teach." Dorothea handed her a length of blue calico across the counter. "Then go teach." Callum said nothing when she told him about the offer that evening. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without interruption, and when she finished, he looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her. "Do you want it?" he asked. "Yes." "Then take it." She looked at him. "You don't mind?" It was not quite a question, but it carried the uncertainty of someone who has learned not to assume. "Isobel." He said her name with the quiet weight of someone who means what they are about to say. "I told you before we were married that if work brings you purpose, I see no reason against it." He paused. "I meant it then. I mean it now." He looked at her steadily. "This ranch needs a partner who is here because she chooses to be, not because she has nowhere else to stand." She held his gaze. "I choose to be here," she said. He nodded once, as if this had settled something he had not known was unsettled. "Then teach," he said, "and come home after." Winter moved through the ranch in its long, white increments. She taught 3 mornings a week, riding Daisy the 4 miles into Willow Creek and back, the road familiar now in all its variations of light and weather. There were 11 children in her classroom. She knew each of them within a week, knew the particular shape of their difficulties and the particular quality of their capacities, which were never the same thing and never what the surface suggested. There was a girl named Clara who could not sit still, but whose written work, when she finally produced it, had a precision and clarity that her restlessness entirely concealed. There was a boy named Henry who sat very still and appeared to be listening carefully and retained almost nothing, and who turned out to have a significant problem with his hearing that his family had not identified, and that a simple adjustment in classroom positioning largely resolved. She thought about Tommy Alcott. She had written him a letter in early December, addressed to the school, not knowing if it would reach him. She had not expected a reply. In January, a letter arrived, addressed in large, careful, uneven handwriting to Mrs. Isobel Dray, Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. It said, "Dear Miss Hale, I can read a whole book now. I read 3. I am not afraid of the hard words. I remember what you told me about them." She sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the journal between 2 pages near the end and closed the cover. Callum came in from the barn and found her sitting there with her hands on the closed journal and her eyes not quite focused on anything in the room. He did not ask. He poured her coffee and set it beside her hand and sat down across from her and opened his own book. After a while, she picked up the coffee. After a while longer, she smiled, not at him, just at the table, at whatever she was thinking. He looked at her over the top of his book, then back down at the page. But he was not reading. April came in slow and green, the snow pulling back from the lower pastures first, retreating up the hillsides, as if reconsidering its commitment to permanence. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The cattle moved back out to the spring pasture with the unhurried certainty of animals who have survived a Wyoming winter before and understand that the grass is better for the waiting. It was a Tuesday morning in early April when Isobel stood at the fence line at the edge of the home pasture and watched the light come across the hills and felt, with a certainty that had arrived quietly and without announcement, that something had changed. She stood for a long time with one hand resting on the top rail of the fence and the other pressed lightly against her own middle. Callum found her there an hour later. He came across the pasture from the direction of the barn, his coat open in the mild morning, and he stopped when he saw her face. She did not say anything. She reached out and took his hand from his side and held it for a moment. Then she placed it gently against her middle. He went very still. The pasture was quiet around them. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the long grass. 2 notes and then silence, then the 2 notes again. "Isobel," he said. His voice was different, lower and rougher and stripped of everything that was not the one thing he was feeling. "Yes," she said. He did not move for a long moment. His hand was warm and still against her, and she could feel, through his palm, the particular quality of a man absorbing something too large to absorb all at once and not trying to rush the process. Then he made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a breath and a laugh, something that carried in it the whole weight of 2 years of solitary mornings and empty rooms and a grave on a hill and a sentence written and never finished. And she felt it move through him like the first crack in river ice in spring, the sound of something that had been held rigid for a very long time, beginning, finally, to move. He lifted her carefully, not demonstratively, not with the broad gesture of a man performing joy for an audience, quietly, as if she were something that required care in the handling, and held her against him in the morning light of the April pasture while the meadowlark called its 2 notes into the wide Wyoming sky. "I didn't think," he said against her hair. He stopped. "I had stopped thinking that I could." She did not answer. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solidness of him and the warmth of him and the way his arms held her, as if letting go were not something he was prepared to do anytime soon. Around them, the ranch went on being itself. The cattle grazed, the creek ran, the hills held their last patches of snow in the shaded creases where the sun had not yet reached. The meadowlark called again. James Callum Dray arrived in the first week of October, just as the aspens on the hillside were turning gold. Dorothea Marsh came as midwife, arriving within the hour of the first sign and staying through the long night that followed with the steady competence of someone who has done this enough times to know that the most valuable thing she could offer was not expertise but presence. Callum did not leave. Isobel had not asked him to stay and had not asked him to go, and he had made his own decision about that early in the evening and did not revisit it. He sat in the chair beside the bed and held her hand when she wanted it held and let her go when she needed to move and did not speak unless she spoke first and did not flinch at anything the night required of him. He was less steady than he appeared. She could feel that in his hand, in the way his grip changed through the long hours, tightening and easing in the rhythm of his own fear, which he was managing with the same quiet determination he brought to everything difficult. When James arrived, just before dawn, with the particular outrage of a healthy newborn confronted with the shock of existence, Callum sat forward in the chair and looked at his son and did not move or speak for a long moment. Dorothea placed the baby in Isobel's arms and stepped back and gave the room the silence it needed. "He's perfect," Callum said finally, barely above a whisper. The words of a man for whom the ordinary language of emotion has temporarily become insufficient, and who is using the simplest words available because they are the truest. Isobel looked at him over the top of her son's head, at the face she had been learning for a year now, its composure and its depths. And in this moment, neither. Just the open, unguarded face of a man who has received something he had stopped believing he was allowed to hope for. "Come here," she said. He came to the edge of the bed, and she shifted carefully, and he sat beside her and looked at the boy in her arms. And after a moment, he put one large, careful hand on James's back, covering it almost entirely, and the boy settled under the warmth of it the way small things settle when they find something solid to rest against. September came again. 1 full year since a stagecoach had rattled to a stop in front of Willow Creek Station, and a woman in a faded blue dress had stepped down onto the platform and tried to hold herself together in the September light. The evening of the 14th was cool and clear, the first stars appearing in the east while the west still held its last color, that particular deep amber that Wyoming skies carry in autumn like a held note. Callum came to the kitchen door after supper and said, "Come with me." She had learned over the course of a year to trust that sentence. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and followed him out of the house and across the yard and up the path that wound through the dry grass to the hill behind the ranch. James was asleep in his cradle, Dorothea sitting with him at Callum's arrangement because Callum had thought ahead, which was something he always did about things that mattered to him. The grave was quiet in the evening light. The fieldstone marker held the last warmth of the day in its surface. The wild grass around it had gone gold with the season. Callum crouched and set down a small bunch of the purple wildflowers, the kind that grew along the fence line, the same kind that had been in the vase on the windowsill the day Isobel arrived. Isobel crouched beside him. She had brought her own offering, a small thing carried in her pocket. She set it beside the flowers, a folded piece of paper, a copy of Tommy Alcott's letter in her own handwriting, because it seemed like the right kind of thing to leave in a place that held the memory of a woman who had believed that if something was worth keeping, it was worth marking. They stayed there for a while in the evening quiet. "She would have liked you," Callum said. "I know," Isobel said. "I would have liked her." He looked at the stone. "She used to say that the people we love don't stop being ours just because they stop being here." He paused. "I didn't believe her for a long time. And now?" He looked at her. In the last of the evening light, his face was open in the way it only was in certain moments. The rare, unguarded way that she had come to understand was not given easily and was not given to everyone. "Now I think she was right about most things," he said. They walked back down the hill together as the stars came fully out over Wyoming. More stars than any city sky ever showed. The whole enormous, patient sky doing what it had always done, indifferent to the small human lives below it, and somehow, because of that indifference, making those lives feel more precious rather than less. Inside the house, James stirred in his cradle. Copper was asleep by the hearth. The fire Dorothea had built up before she left was burning steadily. The good, solid burn of seasoned wood that would last the night. Isobel went to the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. She took down the small wooden box, the one she had made space for in the first weeks, the one that held the things she was not willing to lose. She opened it. Inside, folded carefully, was the handkerchief. The one Callum had pressed into her cold hands on a September platform when she had been holding herself together with the last of what she had. Washed clean now, the linen soft with laundering, folded into a precise square. She held it in her palm. Callum came to stand beside her. He looked at what she held. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the pocket close to his chest where he kept the things he carried nearest. He took out a handkerchief, the same weight of fabric, the same weave, but older, more worn, embroidered in the corner in blue thread, in the hand of a woman who had believed that things worth keeping were worth marking. Nora. He placed it in his open palm beside hers. 2 handkerchiefs in 2 open hands, side by side in the firelight. Isobel looked at them for a long moment. Then she placed her hand over both of them, over the old grief and the new beginning, over the love that had not ended and the love that had not been expected, over everything that had been lost and everything that had, against all reasonable probability, been found. Callum closed his hand gently over hers. In the cradle across the room, James made the small, contented sound of a child who does not know yet what the world is capable of taking and has not yet learned to be afraid of the winter. The fire burned. The stars turned over Wyoming. And in the house that had been built by one man's hands and filled by 2 people's courage, the night settled into its long quiet, and there was nothing left to pretend.